The views expressed in this course are those of the professor and do not necessarily reflect the position or policy of the teaching company LLC, the U.S. Naval War College, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
In the fall of 1950, Mao Zedong's new Chinese government was compelled to intervene in the Korean War. If they didn't intervene, it was pretty clear that Mao's allies in North Korea were going to fall to the combined strength of the UN and South Korean forces. But Mao faced numerous obstacles. For one, he didn't have the military methods or the professional manpower required to go toe-to-toe with the likes of the United States Army and the Marine Corps. What Mao did have in the way of modern military equipment and expertise was scattered all over China. He's still seeking to consolidate the very recent communist revolution. So when the decision was made to intervene in Korea, Mao had to make do with what he had on hand. To even the odds in the battles ahead, Mao made skillful use of two factors our lecture will focus on today: weather and terrain. Knowing that the UN forces had control of the skies over Korea, Mao frustrated their surveillance and bombing efforts by moving his forces across the Yalu River by dark of night. As they moved into North Korea, the lightly armed infantry of the Chinese People's Volunteers took advantage of the mountainous and forbidding terrain to set ambushes for UN and South Korean forces. They were becoming dangerously overextended and spread out. Finally, in a page straight out of Sun Tzu's 12th chapter, the Chinese set fire to forests in northwest Korea and took advantage of the prevailing northerly winds and a fortuitous dense morning fog to cover their advance onto the town of Unsan. That's where the first engagement of the Korean War between Chinese and US troops took place. Mao's surprise attack proved the first step in what would become one of the worst battlefield reversals in US military history. While it's true that Mao is skeptical of many of the Sun Tzu's teachings, especially the idea of winning without fighting, in this case at least, he seemed to appreciate the Sun Tzu's emphasis on exploiting the physical environment. In previous lectures, we discussed some key leadership characteristics such as intellect and discipline. Today we'll see that yet another measure of a great leader is knowing how and when to exploit weather and terrain to achieve the greatest comparative advantage. For all the UN forces' professional leadership and disciplined organization, Mao, like Master Sun, understood that war still takes place in the physical world, a realm of fog, friction, wind, weather, and chance. This is true of almost any competition, though sometimes in a metaphorical rather than a literal sense. Given the harsh realities of our operating environment, if we are to compete successfully, we need to adapt to, overcome, and even exploit the probabilistic nature of the physical world. We need to use weather and terrain to maximize our advantage over the competition. Throughout the Sun Tzu, we see numerous principles and observations that can help us do exactly that. So let's start by examining what the Sun Tzu says about weather. As with many of the Art of War's core concepts, weather comes up in Chapter 1. You'll recall that the character for weather, or probably more accurately termed climate, can also be translated as heaven, Tian. But the Art of War is clearly not concerned about the role of the gods or of heavenly beings in the outcome of battles. What our authors mean by heaven is nothing mystical or metaphysical. It boils down to climatic phenomenon, such as light and shadow, dry and wet, cold and heat, and the changing seasons. In the subsequent section of Chapter 1, where we weigh the relative strengths and weaknesses of two competitors, we're told to ask which side can seize the advantage of climate. It's odd to think that one side could be in a better climatic condition. If it's raining, aren't both armies caught out in the same foul weather? But there are circumstances where one nation or one competitor might be comfortable operating in inclement weather. Think about Napoleon's disastrous campaign in Russia, or the Soviet Union's painful 1939-1940 winter war against Finland, where the Finnish commander was an adroit student of Sun Tzu. In those cases, forbidding weather was an aid to defenders. But in the art of war, climate isn't necessarily a great equalizer or primarily an aid to defenders. It's the side that can seize on climatic conditions that's more likely to succeed in offensive operations. Think of Washington's bold move across the Delaware. That's in late December 1776. It was key to surprising and defeating the Hessians at Trenton. And think also of the elaborate plans for the Allied landings on D-Day. That hinged on favorable weather and tides. And we've already seen that in 1950, the Chinese took advantage of prevailing winds to screen their advance into Korea. Throughout history, great commanders have taken advantage of their environment to increase their chances of success. The section of the book that goes into most detail about the role of weather is Chapter 12, variously translated as incendiary attack or attack by fire. In that chapter, we see that if you plan to use fire effectively on the offensive, you have to be sensitive to the seasons and to wind patterns. Ultimately, incendiary attacks tend to be the most effective when vegetation, the forests, the crops are dry, and when the prevailing winds can be predicted with some certainty. That's usually late summer or early fall. Now you may think that the Sun Tzu's discussion here is rather outdated, dealing as it does with wind patterns and dry vegetation. But in fact, meteorology is one of the most underappreciated yet most critical military sciences even today. And yet the art of war's treatment of climate gets even more sophisticated than simply understanding weather patterns. About 2/3 of the way through Chapter 7, there's a brief discussion of qi. That's Q-I, qi. Now, if you practice certain forms of martial arts or yoga, you might have heard of qi. Typically, the word is translated as spirit or energy, although Star Wars fans might think of it as the Force. Each person has their own qi. And as we know from personal experience, our energy, our enthusiasm can be affected by our surroundings. In my case, I have seasonal affective disorder. It's not debilitating, but it's much harder to motivate in wintertime, especially in the absence of sunlight. So my qi ebbs and flows with the season. In the art of war, however, an entire army of soldiers, of individual soldiers, has a kind of collective qi. It's energy or life force that can wax and wane over the course of a day or of a campaign. During the day, in the morning, the army's qi is waxing. The troops are eager, but at high noon, it is starting to wane and they become indolent. At dusk, the army's qi is literally drawing it homeward. So climate in the art of war involves not just the seasons or the atmospheric conditions, it also involves the time of day. And we know not everyone is a morning person, as the art of war seems to indicate. But still, morning, the dawn of a new day, is an evocative concept that carries a lot of psychological resonance. Think back to the 1984 Ronald Reagan campaign ad, Morning in America. It's a very effective spot, right? Imagery of morning, of rebirth, of hope and promise, along with images of a family moving into a new house and a wedding, expanded the morning metaphor to the idea of a fresh start and a bright future for the nation. So, just as a thought experiment, think about the weather this last season. Think about the weather we've had this month. Think about the weather conditions at this very moment, and about the time of day where you are. How different is your qi at this moment than it would be in a different season or at a different time of the day? If you're in business, how is your organization's energy right now? Can you, like a Sun Tzu general, do something to harness, brighten, or sharpen your organization's qi? So in the midst of a variety of points about climate, we can see that Sun Tzu is making a larger point about the importance of individual and collective psyche to an organization's success. And as a soldier's morale and motivation may be influenced by their actual physical environment, it can also be influenced by their perceptions of that environment. The army, Master Sun tells us, likes to be in the sun and hates being in the shade. Shady areas tend to be damp. That can sap morale, and disease may spread faster in your ranks, mentally and physically damaging your effectiveness. Henry Ford appreciated this. His factories boasted lots of windows, letting in ample natural light and boosting morale, productivity, and safety. Turning from the weather to the complementary topic of terrain, which, like weather, has both physical and psychological dimensions, where the art of war tells us that those skilled in the attack exploit all the varieties of climate, it also tells us that the general who excels at defense entrenches themselves within the 9 folds of earth. Now, defense has traditionally been considered the stronger form of war, as we've seen in Ukraine. It's always easier to hold territory than to take it. At Waterloo, Bunker Hill, Gettysburg, and Gallipoli, clever combatants skillfully used terrain to slow and bloody enemy offensives, right? And since the Sun Tzu is a book about land warfare in an age when armies marched everywhere, it's not surprising that the subject of terrain turns up with almost obsessive frequency. There are 3 entire chapters devoted to the subject. You know how people used to say that the Inuit had 100 different words for snow? Well, that turns out not to be true, but Master Sun does have dozens of names for terrain. We have chapter 9, entitled Maneuvering the Army, or simply Marches. It's probably the easiest to follow on the subject of topography. There, terrain is broken down into 4 general categories: mountainous, riverine, marshland, and plains. And the authors give us various prescriptions for how to move your army through each category of terrain. Chapter 9 also warns us about 5 diabolical terrain features: the heavenly well and the heavenly fissure, to name but 2. These seem to refer to steep cliffs and deep natural hollows and sinkholes. These are the types of terrain traps to avoid at all cost. Chapter 10 expands on the subject. It enumerates 6 configurations that comprise the Tao of terrain. These configurations might appear in all 4 of the categories I just mentioned, and they include open, entangled, stalled, narrow, steep, and distant. Exploiting these, the Sun Tzu tells us, is the way to take control of victory. It is the Tao, the way, of the superior general. And since this Tao hinges on the commander's situational awareness of their environment and of their enemy, it's another area where the general reserves the right to disagree with the ruler, and in some cases to directly disregard their commands. So now we're up to 4 general topographical categories, 5 diabolical terrain features, and 6 terrain configurations. But the Sun Tzu doesn't stop there. Chapter 11 adds another 9 characters of ground upon which belligerents might meet. The first 2 on this list, scattering ground and light ground. Scattering ground is where one belligerent fights on his own territory. Light ground is where one belligerent has crossed into enemy territory, but not very deeply. According to the art of war, scattering and light ground, that's where your army is psychologically weaker and is more likely to desert. But that doesn't seem right. That's counterintuitive, right? We tend to think of soldiers fighting fiercely to defend the homeland. So either fighting on your own land or just across the border should make you more motivated, right? But remember the context. These are armies of illiterate farm boys, and despite their training, many are still yearning for hearth and home. The closer to home they are, the more likely they are to break and run. George Washington had this problem with the colonial militias. And also remember the twist that the art of war puts on logistics. You want to take food from the enemy. The closer you fight to your homeland, the more pressure you and your enemy will put on your domestic economy. Ideally, you want to march forward onto another of those 9 characters of ground, what the Sun Tzu calls weighty terrain, meaning terrain that is deep inside enemy territory. On weighty terrain, it tells us, you seize the strategic initiative. You bring the direct and immense costs of war directly to the enemy's home front. Another advantage of weighty terrain is that your forces are more unified. They have no choice but to stick together. And since your enemy is now on scattered terrain, their soldiers are more likely to flee for their homes at the first battlefield reversal. This was how General Sun Wu is said to have defeated the larger state of Chu, first by using his smaller, nimbler army to harass Chu's forces along the border, but then striking deeply and decisively into the Chu heartland. So we can see in this discussion of the 9 characters of ground that Sun Tzu isn't just talking about physical terrain. He's talking about a kind of psychological terrain. The most psychologically intense terrain is the 9th on the list, death ground, from which the only escape is a desperate struggle. It's on death ground that even the most cowardly of creatures will display the same heroism as the greatest legendary heroes. And a skillful commander should be able to manipulate the perceptions of their own soldiers, as well as the enemy's perceptions, to optimize the physical and psychological advantages of terrain and weather in order to capitalize on opportunities and to minimize threats. So our clever combatant is doing more than knowing the enemy, knowing themselves, knowing the weather, knowing terrain. They're also actively manipulating all 4 of those things. That's a lot to put on the leadership, but it's not radically different from what people in contemporary business strategy do, especially when they look at strategy through the SWOT matrix, SWOT. SWOT is a way of preparing for competition by systematically working through 4 big categories: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and trying to anticipate how the convergence of those 4 will play out in the actual competition to come. One way to look at the structure and arrangement of the art of war is through this SWOT analysis matrix. The early chapters deal primarily with weighing the innate strengths and weaknesses of each side. In other words, the internal environments of the 2 belligerents. The middle chapters, what we're discussing today, deal primarily with operating in the physical environment, an environment in which you want to capitalize on opportunities provided by the terrain and weather to exploit your strengths, while at the same time dealing with threats posed by both the enemy and the environment, so as to compensate for your weaknesses. And the truly clever combatant is also trying to induce the enemy to do the reverse. In other words, to expose their weaknesses and make them fail to fully exploit their strengths. It's not surprising then to see that even in these chapters that are hip deep in topography, that the art of war keeps returning to the importance of smart leadership and of a disciplined and responsive organization. To illustrate how these leadership and organizational factors converge with today's topics of weather and terrain, I'd like to turn to a dramatic historical example. So let's travel from ancient China westward to ancient Greece, where in 480 BCE, at the strategic pass of Thermopylae, a modest force of heavy Greek infantry, known as hoplites, a number about 7,000, managed to hold off a Persian army, anywhere from 10 to 20 times their size. The pass at Thermopylae is an example of what the art of war defines as a narrow, or sometimes translated as constricted configuration of terrain. That configuration enables one side to deploy across it and await the enemy in a highly advantageous position. The Thermopylae Pass was approached by a winding path, and at their widest, the Hot Gates, the translation of Thermopylae, was for maybe 100 meters across. That allowed King Leonidas, commanding his 300 Spartans, along with their Greek allies, to deploy a dense phalanx of hoplites, perhaps 120 men across and many, many ranks deep. With their body armor, heavy round shields, and long spears, a hoplite phalanx was a highly cohesive and coordinated machine of death. Among the Greeks, the Spartans, as the only state with a permanent standing military, were the ultimate masters of the methods, or fa, of hoplite warfare. They were the most disciplined, the most cohesive, and the best coordinated army in Greece. And yet a hoplite phalanx has some distinct weaknesses. In particular, the phalanx is a linear fighting machine. It could only really fight in one direction. And while its forward shield wall is almost impenetrable to everything but another phalanx, its flanks were exposed and highly vulnerable. Additionally, apart from the disciplined Spartans, most hoplite armies tended to pull to the right, as each individual soldier sought additional protection behind the shield of the man to his right. What this meant in battle was that as 2 phalanxes marched toward each other, the less disciplined army would start to drift right and therefore expose its left flank. But as we'll see in a moment, the terrain at Thermopylae not only maximized the strengths of this Greek way of war, it also virtually erased the traditional weaknesses of the phalanx. Before I explain how, I want to note an interesting wrinkle. Thermopylae is actually two terrain types simultaneously, and that affects the warriors defending the pass in discrete ways. At the strategic level, Thermopylae, which should be scattered terrain because it's on the frontiers, is actually death ground. The defense at Thermopylae is the defense of all of Greece in the face of a Persian invasion. And because they are on death ground, all the warriors at Thermopylae, coming from all those different Greek city-states, are all unified in a Greek identity. This has a profound psychological impact on their ability to fight, and to fight fiercely together. Meanwhile, the physical configuration makes Thermopylae constricted terrain. Again, that makes all the Greeks defending the pass essentially Spartans at the tactical level. But what do I mean by Spartan at the tactical level? Think about it this way. The huge Persian army is advancing out of the west. Leonidas deploys his phalanx from south to north across Thermopylae. On the southern or left flank of the Greeks was a bluff, defended above by another detachment of hoplites. So the left flank was secure. On the right flank is the Gulf of Malea. There's a cliff there. So the Persians could not outflank the phalanx on that side. But more than this, the Gulf prevents the Greeks from drifting right. In other words, the terrain made every Greek at Thermopylae as disciplined and as steadfast as a Spartan. As a result, the Greek army's already impressive strengths were channeled directly at the advancing Persians. So the narrowness of the terrain and the strength of the Greek position, that also prevents the Persians from exploiting their far greater strengths in cavalry, archers, and in sheer numbers. And yet, arrogance in their apparent superiority led the Persian king to order suicidal attacks that broke like bloody waves against the hoplites' interlocked shields. Early in the battle, however, Leonidas had deployed smaller units forward along the winding path to the main pass to meet advancing Persian contingents. There, superior discipline and weaponry and favorable terrain allowed the Greeks to inflict thousands of casualties on the Persians. As the chi, the energy of those forward units, began to wane, Leonidas could swap them out with fresh hoplites itching for action. In this manner, Leonidas essentially annihilated the first several waves of Persian attacks. Late in the first day, the Persians sent in their most elite force, the Immortals. The Greeks feigned a retreat, encouraging a rash and undisciplined attack. The Persian elite was savaged. The second day of the battle went no better for the Persians. But on the third day, the Persians discovered a footpath through the hills above Thermopylae that threatened to transform the Greek position from constricted terrain to Sunza's encircled terrain. It's the same piece of ground, but its configuration can change based on the relative position of the opposing forces. Realizing that the pass would soon be encircled, Leonidas sent away most of his allies and stayed behind with around 1,500 men to cover the Allied retreat and to slow the Persian advance. He committed that remaining cadre to defend what was now entirely death ground, and almost all of the Greeks died, but not without costing the Persians precious time and resources. The art of war warns us against attacking a force on death ground for exactly that reason. Most people who read Sun Tzu's Art of War start by looking at individual concepts in isolation. The idea of this course, however, is to be systematic and cumulative. So as we reflect on the story of the Battle of Thermopylae, we should note how it highlights the complementary and cumulative nature of the Sun Tzu. At a total cost of around 2,000 dead hoplites, the Greeks inflicted tens of thousands of casualties on the Persians. Had they not been betrayed and the footpath revealed by a herdsman, the scales would likely have been even more lopsided. Ultimately, at Thermopylae, superior Greek military methods, the inspired leadership of Leonidas, the superior morale and discipline of the hoplites, and the brilliant exploitation of terrain contributed to the salvation of Greece. And that's why I think that Thermopylae is a great example of the Sunzian maxim to know the enemy, know yourself, know the weather, and know the terrain. So far, we've been talking about weather and terrain in a literal sense, literal winds and seasons, and literal hills and plains and passes. But what if we use the terms weather and terrain in a broader, more metaphorical sense? In that case, we might talk about a nation's political climate or the competitive terrain that a company contends with. This broader non-physical environment will also contain critical enablers and impediments to achieving your desired objectives. Your organization may have particular strengths and weaknesses, but the metaphorical weather and terrain will present unique opportunities and threats. A good political example of this was the first Gulf War. Back in 1990-1991, President George H.W. Bush was operating in a favorable, but still complex, diplomatic climate, a climate that Bush was able to exploit to form a remarkably broad coalition. In turn, cooperation from Saudi Arabia and Turkey gave the United States and its allies far more favorable strategic terrain on which to operate, coming at Iraq on two potential fronts, and leaving Saddam Hussein with his backup against his arch nemesis, Iran. After expelling Iraq from Kuwait, however, President Bush was reluctant to put Saddam Hussein on death ground by pursuing a retreating enemy. In Bush's mind, the U.S. domestic climate was not favorable to a larger or more costly war, and the climate and terrain of the U.S.-led coalition would have been vulnerable had Saddam Hussein chosen to lash out. Bush was particularly concerned that Israel might get involved, which threatened to alienate the coalition's Arab members. So we can see that in many cases, clever combatants make the most out of the climate and terrain in which they're operating, but they're still constrained by it. In other cases, a brilliant strategist may be able to proactively shape the environment to increase their comparative advantage and the chances of gaining profit and achieving success. For example, we talked about Henry Ford last time. Wasn't environmental shaping a big part of his success? By transforming the very concept of the automobile, paying his workers more, Ford created a demand climate for his products. By lobbying for more roads, bridges, and highways, and by championing the proliferation of service stations, Ford had a hand in transforming the physical and cultural terrain of the United States itself. And lastly, he transformed Detroit. Ford created what business school faculty call a cluster phenomenon. Detroit became a cluster of innovation, human talent, and competitive advantage that benefited Ford as well as the other companies that headquartered there. That in turn gave the U.S. an overall competitive advantage in the global automotive business. Detroit would also play a big role in our victory in World War II. The cluster that Ford helped to create there anticipated the human, institutional terrain, and intensely competitive climate of Silicon Valley today. And if we look at other competitive venues, we'll probably see lots of other examples of this brand of environmental exploitation and transformation. But for now, think about your own situation. Do you have a decision to make? If so, how might the metaphorical weather and terrain help you choose the best course of action? What kind of terrain does your organization occupy? Is it favorable? Are the ground and weather right for a bold offensive move? Or should you stay on the defensive and let your competition's ill-timed offensives wash over you? Is there a way to alter your environment? Or is it your competition that's trying to change the playing field? For a strategist in ancient Greece or ancient China, it would have been easy to see terrain and weather as something completely outside your control, even tyrannical or diabolical. Yet even then, the environment could be mastered and turned to the advantage of a clever combatant, even one like King Leonidas at Thermopylae, who's operating at distinct disadvantages in terms of manpower and materiel. But what he did have going for him was the legendary fighting spirit of the Spartans, their chi. In our next lecture, we'll return to the subject of chi to discuss the importance that the art of war places on energy and timing. I'll see you then.